recently, as we've been going through our sermon series on the book of Acts in church, we were talking about the man Stephen. And Stephen, you'll remember, was one of the 7 men who were selected to oversee the kind of feeding program of the church, to make sure that the food for the widows was being provided equitably. And there's a couple of things in the book of Acts, in chapter 6, where Stephen's character is described. In verse 5, it says, Stephen, a man full of faith and of the Holy Spirit. In verse 8, it says, Stephen, full of grace and power, was performing great wonders and signs among the people. And then, as he's performing these great wonders and signs, this man who is described as full of faith, full of the Holy Spirit, full of grace, and full of power, began to be challenged by some of the other people. And they had a debate of sorts. And then in chapter 6, verse 10, it says, they were unable to cope with the wisdom and the spirit with which he was speaking. And so, unfortunately for Stephen, but I suppose fortunately for the spread of the gospel, that resulted in Stephen being martyred. And I think some of us want to skip right to the point where people are unable to cope or unable to deal or unable to answer our arguments, our reasoning when we talk about our faith. But that wasn't the beginning point for Stephen. The beginning point for Stephen was that he was a man full of faith and of the Holy Spirit, that he was a man full of grace and power as that faith and that walking with the Spirit were lived out. And what they weren't able to cope with was not Stephen's witty arguments, was not his pithy put downs. What they weren't able to cope with or argue with was the wisdom from the Spirit that Stephen was speaking, with which Stephen was speaking. See, when we are people who are people of faith, when we are people who are cooperating with the Holy Spirit, when we are people who are full of grace, our words have power, because it is not human wisdom, it's the wisdom of the Spirit. So how do we get there? We get there by spending time in this book. We get there by praying and asking God to reveal to us, first of all, those areas of our lives where we need to make changes, where Christ-like character needs to be developed in us. Yes, we need to know the reasons for our faith. We need to know how to defend what we believe. But if we're not speaking with the wisdom that comes from walking with the Spirit, then our arguments are going to fall on deaf ears. And worse than that, they may cause somebody to say, if that's what a Christian is like, I don't want to be one. So I would encourage us today, let's be like Stephen. Let's be full of faith, full of the Holy Spirit, full of grace, full of power that comes from walking with the Spirit, and then full of the wisdom that comes from God. And let's let that affect our speech today.